Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. This year, our institute is commemorating its 25th anniversary under the logo of a quarter century making history. Today's event is brought to you by one of the Baker Institute's longstanding and dynamic research programs, namely the China Studies Program. It was founded 20 years ago, and the program continues to explore China's place in an increasingly transnational world. This afternoon, we look forward to an engaging discussion on China's future. As the term limit of Chinese General Secretary Xi Jinping was lifted over 1 year ago, it became very clear that domestic Chinese society would be shaped by increasing political consolidation. At the same time, trade disputes between China and the United States have become a major issue, which continue to garner significant international attention, prove that China is also undergoing significant change in terms of its foreign relations. So today's panelists, in turn, will interrogate how political reform in China will play out, as well as what domestic and international factors it will be shaped by. Today's panel is moderated by Dr. Steve Lewis, the C.V. Starr Transnational China Fellow at the Baker Institute, as well as a professor in practice and associate director of Rice University's Chao Center for Asian Studies. We would like to thank Steve and our 4 distinguished panelists for making this timely discussion possible. So please join me in welcoming Steve Lewis to the podium.
Thank you all for coming. This is our 6th year of having a Politics of Reform in China panel. And as in years past, we've scoured the universities and colleges of Texas and found our best experts. And every year I look around and we try and decide who we're going to ask this year to come. I'm just amazed at the amount of talent we have here just nearby that we can draw upon. And so fortunately we found these 4 experts here to share with us today their knowledge. You can, rather than go through their biographies, we've listed them for you in the program. And before we get started, I just wanted to say, please hold your questions until after all of them have finished their presentations, and we'll have a long question and answer session. And then we'll adjourn afterwards out to have some refreshments outside and just informal talk with the panelists and amongst yourselves. And so we hope you can join us for that as well. I also just wanted to shout out as well the Chao Center for Asian Studies, which is, as it turns out, it is their 10th anniversary. They are one of our co-sponsors for tonight's event. So now I'd like to ask Dr. Feng, Sung-Yi Feng, to go ahead and start us off. Thank you.
All right. So I'm from Rice, from Political Science Department. My research interest is in international organizations in the past. I'm also interested in international politics, international conflict in my more recent research. So how do I flip the pages? This one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, so when I was thinking about this presentation, I felt pretty challenged because I don't know what kind of knowledge level I should assume about this crowd. So I ended up thinking that I'm going to do what I do best, which is based on my academic research, and also try to strike a balance between a theoretic and as well as more of a sort of informational aspect. Which would appeal hopefully to the public. The first part I'm going to talk about is how I think about this problem between U.S. and China relations. There's plenty of information every day, appears in newspapers, so I don't necessarily think that this audience lacks information. Rather, I'm going to present to you how academics, or myself, for example, approach the problem of processing that numerous information or incredible amount of information about China. So the first part of my talk will be about the framework that I'll use to analyze this huge amount of information. And the second question that I'll get at is, as my topic suggests, that I'm going to talk about U.S.-China relations in the context of global governance. So what is global governance? I'm going to briefly introduce a definition, and then what is the existing global governance, existing global order. And then I'll talk about what part of that, or what does China want in terms of global governance. Finally, I'll talk about what kind of strategies that China has adopted in pursuing those changes that it seeks. And then I'll conclude by saying that the trade war and a lot of things that we're observing is really part of this bigger picture, either cooperation or competition between the two countries. So what is the framework that I use to analyze, say, U.S.-China relations? One of my research interests, as well as I think a lot of scholars use to look at a problem like this. Now, we would start from the assumption that states are rational actors, that they have goals and they have interests that they want to pursue. As rational actors, they would adopt strategies that would best improve their welfare or best pursue those goals. So these are the basic assumptions that we make in looking at a complex problem. Now, cultures can matter, so different cultures can matter in determining what those interests are and what those strategies are, as well as individual leaders' characteristics. So we're talking about President Xi Jinping, and may have a unique personal experience, and those unique characteristics of him may inform the goals that he wants China to pursue, as well as the strategies. But I'm going to leave that behind, at least from my talk, and leave to other speakers in here. But the basic idea is that we do not want to go about a problem idiosyncratically. Sometimes refer to individual leaders' characters, sometimes refer to, there's specific characteristics of Chinese culture, for example, emphasis on face saving that somehow affects China's behavior. They may. But that type of analysis would not get you too far, because something else seems to be very particular. China comes up. Again, you're drawn to that something else. How do you think about a complex problem systematically? The way to think about that is to provide a baseline. And this baseline that I'm providing here is to start from assuming that states are all rational and they adopt strategies to pursue their best interest. And these are very generalizable lenses to every country. Let's start from there. And then when we can't get the explanations that make sense to us, we can start to add these individual characteristics or cultural elements. So what is global governance? Really, it just means how the international system is governed. Without the central government or without a world government, how is the system being run? That's the idea of global governance. It is a combination of, so a lot of times we think of international system as anarchic because of the lack of central authority. But it really doesn't mean that there is anything that's arbitrary can go. There are a lot of things in the international system can constrain state behavior. So for example, power distribution. Some states are more capable than other states because they have more capabilities. So how do states actually practice their foreign policy? And then there are rules and norms. A lot of times we talk about that, the United States want a rule-based system. Maybe China does not want a rule-based system. I'll get back to that. But there are rules and norms that govern state behavior as well. Some rules are some behavior is more acceptable than other behavior. And then there are multilateral international organizations, WTO, IMF, World Bank. So the United Nations, obviously. So their IOs also govern state behavior. Finally, at least one of the most important elements in the current system is that there is an alliance system emanated from the United States. So the United States has some 50 plus allies in the world and hundreds of military bases around the world. So it's really not empty or chaotic in a sense. So what is the existing system like? I know a lot of times we hear that somehow the United States seems to be disadvantaged by the current system. But that is really not backed by historical facts. The current system is really set up by the United States. The United States is the sole hegemon. So we use the word hegemon in international relations as who makes the rules. So the United States has been the rule maker in the current existing system. And this is demonstrated by the fact that the major international organizations that we generally think about, including the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organizations, they were all set up by the United States right after the World War II. So you imagine if we think of the United States as a rational actor, you would expect the one that was setting up the institutions would want them to work for its interests, right? We couldn't imagine that a rational actor would set up institutions in such a way that will undermine its interest. So the idea that somehow the system is not set up in the U.S. benefit go counter the assumption, what I think is reasonable, that states are rational actors. Secondly, outside of institutional power, the United States has been the largest economy in the world. So that a lot of power comes with being the largest economy, largest market, most developed technologically. Lots of privileges come with that fact. And I just talked about U.S. being the dominant military power, had some 50-plus alliances. China has perhaps North Korea, Pakistan, more recently, 2 formal allies. 50-plus allies of the United States are formal allies, meaning that they're at least a piece of paper where the U.S. signed with another country, being military allies. On the other hand, even though China has been powerful compared with a lot of countries, certainly compared with the United States, it has been a rule taker, meaning that it joined these institutions and by and large have to abide by what the rules are. So, for example, think about, United Nations is one place where both countries are veto players. So 2 countries are 2 of the permanent members of the Security Council. So it seems that there are some comparability between the 2 countries in the United Nations. Think about the IMF. So IMF has different voting powers based on the country's economic, a lot of characteristics of country's economic situation. So for a long time, China's voting right has been behind even smaller European countries. The United States has been enjoying 16% of voting right in the IMF. Now, that doesn't sound a lot, right? But here's the trick. The most important decisions in the IMF has to achieve 85% support. So by having about 16% to 17%, the United States is de facto the only veto player in the IMF. So that's how the institution is set up. And also traditionally, the head of the IMF has always been a European, which is ally of the United States, and the head of the World Bank has always been sent by the United States. So these 2 major international organizations have been headed by either someone from the United States or from an allied country. So a lot of these things has been beneficial to the United States' interest. So given that, it seems not surprising that as China become bigger and economically and stronger militarily, that it wants to change how things are set up currently. So what does China want? It's really straightforward. It wants to have more say in how things are determined in international organizations, certainly, but perhaps also around its territory, how things are done around its territory. Now, I want to say a little bit about the IMF, coming back to this. So as China's economy grows bigger, China has contributed more to the IMF funds and World Bank funds. In response to not just China, but other developing countries increasing economic power, the IMF decided to reform the voting share in 2010. However, it took a long time to get it approved. By 2016, it was approved by U.S. Congress. It requires legislative approval in each individual countries, and it took a while for the U.S. Congress to approve it. So in those periods between 2010, when there was an agreement within the IMF that the voting share need to be reformed, to 2016 acquired approval by U.S. legislator, China set up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in 2015, and also initiated the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. So both were initiated in 2013, which is in the span of 2010 and 2016. Some would argue that what China has done is in response to the difficulty to change things within the existing system. I'll come back to that. So to summarize, what China wants is to have more say in the rules in the international system. I think a lot of times in the popular media discussion or political analysis, people tend to phrase it rule-based system versus no rule-based system. We tend not to think that's the right framing of the conflict. China also wants rules, but it also wants to sit at the table and be part of the process of deciding what kind of rules that to govern the world. So it's really not about rule versus no rule, but it's about who gets to say the rules, decide the rules, and what kind of rules. That's where the contentious points are. All right, so what strategies has China adopted in increasing its voice in global governance, in trying to taking care of its expanded interests, economic interests or military territorial interests? So in abstract, we can think of three strategies. Now, the first one is to reform within the existing system. And that's an example of the IMF reform. So China tries to to implement reforms or ask for reforms within the existing system. And sometimes those things come along, sometimes it takes a while to come along, as in the example I gave between 2010 and 2016. Another strategy is to set up a new institution based on its own leadership. So we can think of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in those lenses. So China set up this parallel institution to the World Bank in particular that focuses on infrastructure investment bank. Now you wonder, under what conditions you will pursue one strategy versus the other. Now, at least at first, it seems that it makes more sense to work within the existing system and increase your power, because it's less costly. There is an infrastructure. All you need to do is to increase your voting share to shape the decisions. It will be less costly up to a point. If you can't get it done, for example, the reforms are not forthcoming, then the alternative of setting up a new institution, which is extremely costly, and I'll explain why it's costly, becomes an attractive option. So really, these two things are not separate. You think about what is your power growth within the existing system, and to what extent that you can push it. If this is not coming, you can't come through within this existing system, that the other more costly options become relatively more attractive. Now, why is a new institution more difficult? Now, first of all, the United States is de facto leader. So there's a web of international institutions and norms and rules that's set up by the existing power. So as a rising power, you need to break that network. You need to win friends. You can't set up an international multilateral organization without others following you, right? So as the leader of an institution, not only you need to provide some public good so that others want to join, you also have to have the support of these others who are willing to buy in your philosophy, buy in what you want to do with the new institution. So it is a very difficult bargaining process where you try to win friends or try to reduce their concerns about what are you going to do. Are you going to be the dictator in the new institution? How the rules going to be set up? Where do I stand in that organization? Things like that. So a new institution is really costly to establish. And we also often overlook the expertise requires to run an international institution. I often make this argument. So think about the United States has run the world for over 70 years. So there's a tremendous amount of expertise accumulated for running the world, and there's a lot of personnel and human capitals to develop. So there's a stream of diplomats and technocrats who know how to run these institutions. And China has, like I said, has been root taker. So it's really, at best, a willing participant of the WTO, of the IMF. To go from willing participant and become the leader, it requires a different set of skills. I'm sure a lot of you here understand the difference between a team member versus the leader of an organization. So there's an incredible amount of expertise gap between the US and China as well. So setting up a new institution is not something so automatic and obviously a good strategy. All right, so apparently people have made this connection between the difficulty reforming within the existing institution and the sort of attractiveness of setting up a new institution. Now, a third strategy is bilateral strategy. So thinking back on coalition of the willing or so bilateral strategies, which the current U.S. administration has been pretty interested in taking, with Mexico, Canada doing it individually. So as I mentioned, that rising power is faced with the existing apparatus arrangements. So how do you break through those web of institutions? And one of the strategies is really going back to the very basics, try to win friends one by one. So this Belt and Road Initiative is of that nature. There's a lot of bilateral partnerships that China is forming, particularly with developing countries. In Africa, in Latin America, try to build government-to-government relationships, bilateral relationships, and trickle down from the top to more of the economic relationships between enterprises and between corporations. So these has been China's strategy to try to get into the some sort of leadership in the global governance or chip away U.S. influence, however you think of it. Reform within the existing system. When it's very difficult, set up a new institution, and bilateralism to win friends politically and economically by offering what they need and in return get more influence as well as economic interests. So that's how I would think about the Belt and Road Initiative and AIIB. China has not adopted alliance strategy. There's a lot of discussion in China, or has been in China, about whether or not it's a good idea to form military alliances. At least for now, the dominant view is that that is not something that necessarily in China's interest, because inevitably when you form military alliances, now you are aiming to some third party, and that doesn't seem to be very appealing from China's perspective. And China also has had bad experience from alliances during the Cold War. So to summarize, what I've hopefully conveyed is that right now there is a transitional period between U.S. and China about global governance. There's a lot of uncertainty about each other's intentions. So how far is China going to go in terms of either squeezing U.S. influence or replacing U.S. influence? There's a lot of uncertainty from the U.S. side about China's intentions, but also from China's side about what is U.S. intention toward China, whether it's containment or eliminating competition or accommodating or many different guesses at this point. Trade war, as I see it, is very much a part of this bigger competition and cooperation at the international level. This is why I don't necessarily think that trade war can be resolved, well-defined trade war and resolved by itself. It is much more about how do China and U.S. see each other in the future as two countries coexisting in one international system. Domestic politics is going to provide another important source of uncertainty, both in the U.S. and in China. I think eventually the two countries would have to work out how to coexist in this world. When you think about a war, you think that's the end of the game. It's not the end of the game. After a war, both countries will still exist. It doesn't mean that the war itself going to solve problem. Countries would still have to figure out how to coexist assuming the other side going to always be there. So a lot of times people think when they think of U.S. and China going to fight a war maybe in the next 10 years, they think that's somehow a solution to problems. I don't necessarily think that's a way to solve the problem. I hope that when a lot of uncertainty is resolved through frequent interactions about each other's intentions and capabilities and domestic conditions, eventually there will be some sort of grand bargaining about how two countries going to coexist in the world system. And I think the other problems will be solved based on that general big picture understanding about the relationship. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Fong. I'd now like to invite Professor Firestein.
You see, okay.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for the gracious hospitality. It's a real privilege for me to be here at Rice. My oldest living relative, my beloved 90-year-old Aunt Dottie, was a graduate of Rice University in the 1940s, and it has special meaning for me to be here. And I extend my thanks to Steve personally, to Rice University, the Baker Institute for Public Policy, and the China Studies Program in particular, and the other sponsors. And most importantly, I thank all of you for the very generous gift of your time, and I'm privileged to be a part of a very distinguished panel, speaking about a topic that I think is of great importance to our country and to the world, and that is the topic of Chinese political reform. I want to come at the topic a little bit differently from my colleagues and add a slightly different perspective, and namely to look at the question of Chinese political reform from the standpoint of the impact that it's had on U.S. framing and discourse about China. I think when we talk about Chinese political reform in general terms, we tend to think it's self-contained within the borders of the People's Republic of China. But in fact, it often can have a spillover effect into China's most important bilateral relationship as well. So in my presentation, I'd like to talk about 4 different things before wrapping up. Number 1, just a few general comments about political reform in the era of Xi Jinping. Number 2, I want to say a few specific things about the 19th Party Congress, which occurred about a year ago in October of last year, and the National People's Congress, and some of the interesting data points that came out of those 2 very important events on the Chinese political calendar and what those meant in terms of how Americans see China. Number 3, I want to talk about the impact that all of this has had on U.S. perceptions and framing and understanding of China. And number 4, I want to share what I think are the key U.S. government and more broadly American takeaways with respect to Chinese political reform, and I'll offer a few concluding thoughts after that. When I end at about 9:30 p.m. this evening, we'll then go into the next part. Now, I'll try to keep this short, but there's certainly a lot to deal with. So first, let me just say a few words about the topic of Chinese political reform in the era of Xi Jinping. So there's a lot that could be said, but let me hit a couple of high points. Political reform as a term is something that generally has been construed to refer to a process over the long term in China of political liberalization. Generally, the term reform has referred to the notion that things are moving in a particular direction, and that is towards somewhat greater levels of liberalization and pluralism. What I think we see in recent years is that the concept of political reform in China now means something very different. It means something very different not just to American observers or world observers, but to the Chinese themselves. And they've talked about that, I think, pretty openly. So the very concept of Chinese political reform, I think, doesn't mean today what it used to mean. What are the elements of today's Chinese political reform? In very broad terms, I think there are 5 things that are worth flagging. And here, I think most Chinese analysts would agree with everything that I'm saying because, in fact, the Chinese leadership has been very open and honest in exactly what it's intending to do through some of the political reforms that have been implemented in recent years. Number 1, First and foremost, greater control by the Communist Party of China over the country and over Chinese society. That's been the very clear declared policy of the Communist Party itself. It came out of the Communist Party Congress, the 19th Party Congress that occurred a year ago. It's come out of President Xi Jinping's important speeches, and it's very clear that there is a desire on the part of President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party leadership to exert greater, not lesser, control over the Chinese nation as a whole and Chinese society. In terms of Chinese society, you see reports, including within the Chinese media, as well as in foreign media, about the new social sort of record that's kept of people, or a social credit score that's kept regarding citizens, and whether folks are doing the right kinds of things, and on that basis they're either rewarded or punished. So there's a desire for greater CCP control. Number two, there is a greater desire within the party to have increased discipline and ideological focus and sharpness. This explains the anti-corruption campaign that has been ongoing for the last 6 years and which has had a significant impact on Chinese politics. It explains a tendency toward greater ideological focus and toward a sense that everyone needs to be behind, with the program, as we would say, and behind the leadership of President Xi Jinping and his substantial body of political philosophy, known as Xi Jinping thought. So a greater control by the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, and greater discipline within the CCP. The third point I would make is that there is clearly a trend toward greater concentration of power in the top leadership position of China, now encumbered by Xi Jinping. In fact, many would observe that one would have to go back at least to Deng Xiaoping, if not to Mao Zedong, to find a Chinese leader that has had so much political power concentrated in his hands, as Xi Jinping currently has, in a whole variety of capacities in which he serves. Fourth, and this is one that I think goes directly to the issue of the trade war and a whole set of other cascading issues, there has been a slowing or reversal to some degree of what had been a long-time trend in China to move toward market principles. And I think what we're actually seeing today, and many Chinese scholars have written about this, and certainly others in this country and elsewhere have as well, we're actually seeing not only a slowdown, but in some cases a reversal of this 40-year tendency toward letting the market dictate to greater and greater degrees economic activity in China. And that has been a source of enormous concern on the part of the U.S. business community. It's a source of great concern in terms of the U.S. government. It's one of the issues at a profound level that really undergirds the trade war, quote unquote, and that's something that we've seen as well. And then fifth, and this is a point that I think is not made often enough, and that is the idea of what we might call the social contract in China. Historically, over the last 40 years of reform and opening up, I think we can talk about the social contract in very basic terms as the idea that the leadership of China has pledged to the people of China, we will make you rich. And that has been essentially a core element of the social contract. Today, I think there has been a transformation or shift in that contract. Today it is, we, the leadership, will make you proud of your country, proud to be Chinese, and that's at the core of the idea of the Chinese dream, which is one of the principal sort of political ideas of President Xi Jinping, and also it's at the core of the notion of the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. So not only will we, the leadership, make you rich, we will make you prouder than you have ever been to be a citizen of the People's Republic of China. We'll make you proud of your country. That's an important thing that's happened as well. In a nutshell, my judgment is that those 5 elements that I just laid out really constitute the essential core of Chinese political reform today. And as you can tell, for those that have looked at Chinese political reform historically, it takes China in a different direction than China had been going for most of the last 40 years. Now, let me say a few words about the 19th Party Congress, which occurred almost exactly a year ago, and also the National People's Congress, which occurred in March of this year. The trends that I just laid out have been evident really since the 2012-2013 leadership transition where Xi Jinping came to power. But they have really crescendoed, I think, over the last year, dating back to the 19th Party Congress of October 2017 and through the National People's Congress of 2018. For American observers, several things about the 19th Party Congress stood out, and also, by extension, into the National People's Congress. Let me mention, I think, the 5 things that got people's attention in this country, frankly, in a way that was fairly negative. Number one, there was a phrase that was spoken by President Xi and has been spoken by other officials about the Communist Party leading all. The Communist Party will lead all. Government, military, society, and as the phrase goes in Chinese, north, south, east, west, and central, the party will lead all. Those are the words of President Xi Jinping on the public record. Well, those words certainly got people's attention in the United States and elsewhere. And while that's not a fundamental shift from the way things have been in China for many years, the very fact that it would be codified and crystallized in such a direct way was it was a signal that was interpreted in interesting ways and in ways that caused some alarm, I think, in the United States and other countries. Second, the notion put forward by President Xi and by the Chinese leadership of holding China up as an alternative model of development relative to the model provided by the United States is something that has become more explicit and more pronounced in the last year than it has ever been. And American observers heard that as rightly or wrongly, it's a subjective judgment, as a bit of a challenge to the United States. So the notion that China would hold itself up as an alternative model for the developing world for those countries who may not have much interest in U.S.-style democracy. Well, if you don't, come take a look at, quote, our system, we may have something that you like. That idea is something that I think caught some Americans off guard. Number 3, President Xi Jinping, in his 3.5-hour major and very profound speech to the Party Congress, spoke about something that no other Chinese leader in my recollection has spoken about in the modern era. And that is a new way of thinking about the People's Liberation Army, the army of both the party and the People's Republic of China. And that is, he said that, and I'm paraphrasing closely, not the exact words, but I'm laying out his words that were on the public record pretty closely. He said, going forward, we will assess and judge the People's Liberation Army by just one criterion: its ability to fight and win in combat. Now, that's a very normal thing for any leader of a nation to think about. Any U.S. president, any president of any country would say, I, as commander-in-chief of my nation's military, want a military that can fight and win wars. In fact, the language is actually strikingly similar to the language of any number of U.S. presidents of both parties. But it took many Americans aback to hear a Chinese president speaking about judging his military, the nation's military, on the basis of its ability to fight and win wars. Rightly or wrongly, that shocked a lot of people in this country. And I should also note, as another and related note, in terms of things that caught people's eyes and ears as Americans and others were looking at what came out of the Party Congress a year ago, I looked at President Xi Jinping's 3.5-hour speech, at the text of it, the Chinese language version and the English version. There was only one sentence in the 3.5-hour long speech, which was about 70 pages in printed form, that had an exclamation point at the end of it. Only one. And the exclamation point came after, and I'm paraphrasing very closely here, Taiwan is a part of China and we will never let Taiwan go. And that was the only sentence in 70 pages, the only one, I looked very carefully, that had an exclamation point. It also generated the largest round of applause, reportedly, of the entire 3.5-hour speech, and there were quite a few rounds of applause. So these were the things that caught people's ears, that stood out, and that signaled to some American observers that things are going in a different direction in China. Now, by the way, some of the comments, for example, the notion of a military being able to fight and win wars, are in any normal context a very normal thing for a national leader to say. The point that I'm making is that from an American perspective, this was new and this was somewhat alarming. Final point I would make relative to the National People's Congress, and this was in March of this year, but sort of the end of the political cycle that started last fall and concluded this spring, and that was the ending of presidential term limits for the Chinese president. And what's interesting about that is that certainly occurred. It was widely reported. It's a significant political development. But it was generally reported in the United States, and sometimes is still reported in the United States today, under the basic idea of, quote, President Xi Jinping is now president for life. Well, technically that's not what happened. What did happen was a termination of term limits, a repeal of term limits, and it might very well be the case that President Xi now, from a legal standpoint, can remain on as president. But what happens in the future, we'll find out. But the point is that the very fact that in the United States this particular development was reported in the way that it was, which is not necessarily entirely accurately in a strict sense, suggests what the concerns are from a U.S. vantage about someone who may indeed be in office at the pinnacle of Chinese power for as long as he might wish to do so. So these are the things that caught Americans' attention coming out of the 19th Party Congress and the National People's Congress. Let me shift over briefly to talk about the impact of Chinese political developments on U.S. government and broader U.S. framing of China. These developments that I just described have had a significant impact on the framing of China in this country. Bear in mind that during the 2016 presidential campaign, which started for many in 2015, Donald Trump made many references to China. But note that in his first year in office, which was essentially the calendar year 2017, there were virtually no changes whatsoever, no discernible changes whatsoever to U.S. policy toward China. None. And there was a lot of rhetoric, a lot of talk. The candidate, Donald Trump, said he would be, if he were elected, would become very tough on trade. He was in office for almost the entire 2017, in fact, the entire year, and didn't take any actions on the issue of trade. Some even wondered whether it was merely campaign rhetoric and whether all things would essentially just turn out to be how they had been before. And obviously it's gone in a different direction. But the point that I make is it's not that everything changed on the day that Donald Trump took the presidential oath and became president of the United States. It didn't. It started changing not long after the 19th Party Congress in China in October of last year. Let me give you a couple of data points before laying out what I think the key U.S. takeaways are from political development in China. The data points I would point to is right after the October 2017 19th Party Congress, in which, in a sense, Xi Jinping was reselected by his Communist Party colleagues to serve another 5-year term as General Secretary. At that conference, there was the talk of some of these issues that I laid out. Very shortly after that, you started seeing some of the first concentrated spate of articles in this country expressing concern about so-called Chinese influence in the United States. Just about 2 weeks after the conference, you started seeing these articles come out. A month or two later, we saw the FBI director, Christopher Wray, go before Congress and make sweeping and broad brushstroking statements about ethnically Chinese people that basically said that we as a nation have to be very concerned about Chinese scholars and Chinese students. The remarks were so broad brushstroking in their nature that several members of Congress sharply rebuked FBI Director Wray for those comments, in some cases equating them with McCarthyism. But those comments started being generated very shortly, again after the events of last fall. And look at the trade war itself. President Trump started down this road in terms of actual policy, not rhetoric, but actual policy only in March of this year, right around the time that the National People's Congress ended term limits for the presidency and a short period of time after the 19th Party Congress. So the United States government and the U.S. response to China over the last year has not occurred in a vacuum. It has been informed by Chinese political developments. Let me say a few more words before concluding about what I think the main takeaways for the United States government and some others in American society are. And I recognize that Chinese may or may not agree with any of these assessments. In some cases they may, in some cases they may not. But what I want to do is share what I believe, based on a lot of interaction with people very close to the administration, share what I believe are the concerns that the American administration currently has, and that some beyond just the administration in Congress and in the media and in academia and elsewhere also believe to be the case. So I'll lay out briefly here, and I won't expand for now, just 7 key takeaways that I think represent the thinking of the administration and the thinking in some quarters of the United States about China and its political reform. Number 1, Chinese political reform as previously construed is dead. China has ceased any pretensions of seeking to liberalize either politically or economically. That's conclusion number 1. Is that right? Is that wrong? People can debate. I say to you, I think that is the way that most in the administration view this matter. Number 2, China is seeking, according to this viewpoint, China is seeking to advance its interests by any means necessary, and with a whole of government and whole of society approach. Number 3, China sees world affairs through a zero-sum lens, and it sees trade and economic matters through a mercantilist lens. Those are the views that dominate the White House and the senior policy ranks around the president. Number 4, in this viewpoint, China's authoritarian system is actually getting stronger, which is to say it's actually presenting a greater and greater challenge to the United States than it has in years past. Now, this is a very significant point. Think about this particular point. If the United States were of the belief that China's system was doomed to failure because it is not democratic and it is not entirely market-driven, then the United States would not be taking the measures that it's taking right now to combat what it sees as Chinese predatory practices or aggression in the economic or trade sphere. The United States would be sitting back and waiting for China to simply collapse under the weight of its own inefficiency. Undergirding everything that the United States is doing right now is this profound and inconvenient truth. There are many in the United States, including those close to the president, who actually believe China is onto something. They actually may be able, in their view, to outcompete the United States. That's why the United States now, under this president, this administration, feels the need to work actively against China's efforts. It's not because they're ineffectual, it's because they're very effective. So that's something that I think we have to think about and confront as a nation, because we're operating on the premise that China is getting bigger, better, faster, stronger, more capable, more technologically empowered and enabled, and that we actually are facing in this country an existential competitor. So everything we're doing is predicated on the idea that whatever China's doing, it's working. And that's an interesting thing to think about. A couple of other quick points. The U.S., these folks that I'm describing, whose views I'm describing, think that the United States government, the United States generally, broadly, academia, society, that our previous responses to China were inadequate and that we need a new approach. Next, the United States government has, under this president, made the judgment that we need to fight fire with fire And what that means is if China's going to close its markets, then by golly, we're going to close our markets. If you're going to have tariffs, then by golly, we're going to have tariffs. If you're going to limit our student exchanges or other exchanges funded by foundations, then you know what? We'll adopt that as a best practice and we'll do the same thing. If you're going to create issues around not allowing us into sensitive sectors of your economy, then we'll do the same thing. One of the things that's been most striking to me about where the United States government and legislature, the U.S. Congress, has gone in the last year is that it has been, we have a Republican president and Republican control of both the House and the Senate, and yet we have seen the greatest retreat from market principles in the modern history of America occur under Republican leadership in this country. With some of the legislation that has passed, some of the ideas about restricting inbound investment, some of the ideas about telling companies how to chew gum and how to suck an egg and how to control decisions about what to export in terms of technology. We have the government playing so much of a role now, Republican-controlled White House, Republican-controlled legislature, the Congress, playing so much of a role in corporate decisions that we now have the bizarre scenario of Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Elizabeth Warren lecturing the Republican Party on the merits of the free market. This is where we have come. So fighting fire with fire, whether it's good for America or not, I think is a highly debatable premise. Most in the business community believe it is not. But the notion of if you're going to stop us, we're going to stop you. If you're going to hurt us, we're going to hurt you. That's the fight fire with fire mentality we now have. And finally here, before concluding, the U.S. government believes that the asymmetries, especially in the economic and trade issues in the U.S.-China relationship that have existed for a long time, and they have been there, make no mistake, there have been massive asymmetries in the U.S.-China trade and economic relationship, no question about it. Those asymmetries are no longer acceptable to the United States, and it's time to level the playing field. So the point that I would make is that previously the U.S. government operated on an assumption and a premise that a policy of what might be called strategic patience was appropriate because over time China, in this viewpoint, would become a more liberal country politically and most importantly economically, and would open its markets gradually but steadily. And over a long period of time, U.S. companies would reap the benefits of that. The conclusion that's been drawn now is that developments in China over the last 5 to 6 years, and especially over the last year, have led American policymakers to believe that the policy of strategic patience was unjustified and was wrong. And because our assumptions about China were wrong, now our policies need to be changed. Now, Chinese may not agree with this analysis, but my argument to my Chinese friends would be, you don't need to agree with it, you just need to understand that that's the thinking of the administration, because if you don't understand that, we're not going to get anywhere. Likewise, we need to understand the Chinese position. In conclusion, Chinese who are searching for an explanation for why the sudden change in U.S. government thinking about China has occurred, the answer really lies in large measure, and I would say in larger measure than generally understood, in recent Chinese political developments. China needs to understand that its choices, even on domestic matters and internal affairs, have cascading consequences. And when you're the number 2 economy in the world, even your internal developments and internal affairs are of great interest and concern to your international partners, including your most important bilateral partner, the United States of America. We are at a crossroads in the U.S.-China relationship. I still believe there is a path in front of us toward a more functional, mutually beneficial, and politically sustainable relationship that works for both countries. For the sake of our posterity, I pray that our leaders will have the wisdom to find that path. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And now I'd like to invite Professor Liu. Thank you.
Steve, thank you for organizing this panel, and thank you for inviting me. I'm the only economist on the panel, and my research interest is on economic development. So this talk is going to be on a very different aspect of the reform in China. We're going to be focusing on the reform in rural China. And when I say rural China, I'm talking about the residents who have rural hukou. So in China, everyone has a hukou, either the urban hukou or the rural hukou. Okay, so why do we care about people who have the rural hukou? At the onset of the economic reform, actually more than 80% of the entire Chinese population were in rural area, and then they have the rural hukou. Even with the very fast urbanization, up until today, still almost 50% of the entire Chinese population residing in the rural area. So in 2017, there were still more than 570 million residents living in rural area. So you can think about the fact that any small policy change happening in agriculture or on the rural area could actually affect millions and millions of people's life. And in order to understand what kind of challenges that they face today, we must know where it came from. So in today's talk, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the pre-economic reform, what's happening in rural area, the economic reform, and the challenges that the government and the rural residents are facing today. So I think this picture captures very well what it looked like in the pre-reform era in rural China. So everyone is working on this communal farm, and basically the land was pooled, and it's owned by the collectives. People are working together, and then they were assigned work. They don't get to choose what they want to do. And there are these production teams of 30 to 40 households, and also these people's commune of 2,000 households. So the collective, these commune, were the basic unit of decision making. So individual farmers do not get to choose what they want to do, what they want to farm. But the government can decide, or the commune can decide what they should farm together. And then they purchase the inputs and from very heavily subsidized sources, and then they sell the outputs to the government. Basically, there's a quota imposed by the government. So for the American audience, you might be wondering, why would anyone want to do that? There are actually some advantage to the collective farming, because there is economy of scales, right? We all farm together in this really big plot. And for the government's point of view, the government can easily impose the quota or the target they want on each of the commune, rather than imposing on individual farmers, right? So they can actually set the quota for each of the commune. And from the rural residents' point of view, there is actually very good public goods provision. So in this painting that you can see, on one side, okay, there is actually these schools being provided. On your commune, there is school, there is hospital or clinic, and then there is even childcare provided in the commune, and then you eat together, and so that all these public goods are being provided by the government. And not to mention that most important aspect is about the risk sharing. Because in farming, there are a lot of uncertainties. You worry about crop failure, you worry about the flood, you worry about the pest infestation. So when you're working on a commune, that means no matter the times are good or bad, well, the government should be taking care of you. You are set. But oh.
No? Okay. Should work.
Okay, now it's not working.
It's going to come out. Maybe just use it against that.
All right. So how did this system fail? Okay. First, you can imagine, everybody get paid the same. So there's really no incentive to work hard, right? No matter how hard you work, you get paid the same as the slacker next to you. And it's actually very hard for the leader to monitor who is doing all the work, right? Because everybody is assigned a different tasks. So it's very hard to compare output. There's no direct output that they can easily compare. And not to mention, when the government set these procurement quota, the central government set it, it's actually very hard to take into account of what is the comparative advantage for this rural area. Some area may not be suitable for growing rice, and then they may be more suitable for cotton, but then the quota is set. And so it's not surprising that they actually have these very stagnant agricultural productivity. And so here comes the economic reform. So while there was economic reform in the urban area, in the rural area, this household responsibility system was introduced. It was not really introduced by any brilliant policymakers nor economists. Actually, it was a few of the farmers, they got together. They think that they had enough. And they do this secretly, and they decided that we're going to give the land back to the farmers and we'll farm on our own. And so it was started in 1978. It was actually quite a successful case. And so that the central government actually encouraged everyone should adopt this in the rural area. So under this HRS, the land ownership was still owned by the collective. But each of the farmer or each of the household was contracted to have the land for farming. And individuals were actually entitled to the equal share, so they take the whole land from the commune and then divide it equally on a per capita basis. And then each of the household can make their own decision about what they want to farm, how much input they want to use, and if they can actually return some for the quota, they have the residual production, they can sell it in the market, and then they get to keep the residual income. So you can see this was very successful, actually. It was an immediate success in the 6-year period. The grain production itself increased by almost 30% during the 6-year period. And in a paper by Justin Lin in 1992, he found that this HRS actually accounts for more than 40% of the output increase in China. And not to mention that the rural income per capita actually increased by more than 50%. So remember I said any small policy change can actually affect millions of people's life. This was to date the most successful poverty alleviation program in the world, right? During those periods, the rural poverty reduced from 40 to 25%, and then more than 120 million rural residents were alleviated out of the poverty. So if it's so successful, what is the challenges ahead? Well, today I'm going to be able to talk about the issues on the property rights, the expropriation, and the small farming sizes, and then some issue about the rural to urban migration. But for the rest, 3 bullet points, I won't really have time to touch on. Maybe another time. So first, regarding the rural property rights. Remember, the land is actually owned by the collective. The farmers only have the user rights. So do you have the user right for 1 year, or 2 years, or 10 years, right? Regarding how long you have the user right, then you can think about what kind of investment I should make on my farm. If it's very short term, then it's unlikely that you would put in any long-term investment, such as irrigation, that require really huge upfront costs, and then you only reap the benefits in the long run. Or, for instance, there are certain long-term fertilizer that can actually enrich the soil. If you only get the user right for this particular plot for very few years, then you're not going to use all those fertilizer. Right? And so that becomes the issue. Since there's the poor land property rights, then people can hold back their long-term investment. That's actually good for the yield. And the government do try to deal with this issue by imposing this land management law, which actually provided the tenure security for 30-year period. But even with this 30-year period land contract guarantee, there still could be reassignment that's happening within your village. So think about it, it was by per capita basis. That means anytime when your household has a newborn, or someone died within your household, then you could be reassigned. And then therefore you might be losing the lot that you were working on. So this constant worry could affect how farmers making their decision. Next is about the expropriation. I mean, some of the expropriation may be for good. For instance, if the government need to build the road, then they can take back the land very fast from the farmers. However, some of the expropriation may be for the kind of awkward or weird use, right? For instance, there could be private firms want to invest in the rural land. They want to build the factories. Then who get to decide which land to take back? And how much should we compensate to the farmers whose land get taken back? And so you can imagine that's exactly the source of the corruption. So for my own research, I actually do a lot of primary data collection. So I went to the rural area. I had a chance to interact with the farmers in rural area. I remember vividly in 2006, that was the first time I was a PhD student, and then I went with a government research institute to go to rural China to collect data. And so along with me, there are all these PhD master students who were conducting the questionnaires on the farmers. And one farmer called us to the side, and he handed us a letter secretly. He said, "Don't let my village leader know. Okay? And pass this to your leader." He thought that since we're from the research institute, we must have the connection with the central government, right? Not knowing that we're just a bunch of PhD students. And so in this letter, he was trying to expose, right, all this corruption by bribery taking by his village leader. So this is the really sore point and then the difficult issue for the Chinese central government to deal with, because the rural government or the rural village leader actually do have a lot of power in terms of the land taking and reassignment. And this is also the source of the political instability that the government do not want to deal with, okay? Because for many of the dynasty, the overthrow of the dynasty actually came from rural area when the farmers were not happy. And then they could have social unrest and led to political instability. So Chinese government actually tried to establish this hotline where the farmers can now report about any kind of political corruption. And then so among the farmers' petition, actually the land issue, especially expropriation, account for the majority of these reports. And another issue is regarding the farm size. So remember, they have to divide up the land on per capita basis. There are 220 million farm households. So by dividing, on average, each household has about 0.6 hectare of land. So how big is 0.6 hectare? It's about the size of an American football field. You might think, oh, that's pretty big. No, but actually, it could be divided into smaller plots scattered all over the village. So it's very hard to take advantage of the economy of scales. And in comparison, the American farmer has about 195 hectares per household. That's about nearly 300 times bigger than their Chinese counterparts. So you can imagine that while the American farmers are using their harvester, using their tractor on farming, or even helicopter to spray pesticide, the Chinese farmer has to use their hand tool in order to farm on their tiny plot of land. Okay. So now there is actually surplus labor. You might think surplus labor is a great thing. Now we reach more efficiency so that their labor being freed up from the rural area. And then they can actually go to the urban area to work. And then you can see this estimated number of the rural to urban migrants really taken off after 1997. And by 2010 census, there were estimated 220 million rural to urban migrants. And then in most recent estimates, about 280 million rural to urban migrants. How big is 280 million? If you think about nearly 3/4 of the US population they have a home in the rural area, and then they have to work hundreds of miles away, and then their parents or their kids are still in the rural area. They cannot take them with them because they don't have the urban hukou. And then they get to go home only once a year. That's how massive this rural to urban migration is. And most of these rural to urban migration are people moving from the west or the central region to the coastal region. And then concentrated, you can see that people who are moving are generally very young and mostly men. So for more of the elderly and the children, they were actually left behind in the rural area. So the left behind children become one of the main problem for the Chinese government to deal with, because estimated that there are 61 million of the children were left behind. That means their parents are working in the urban area, but the parents were not able to take their kids with them. They can only left the kids with the elderly who are taking care of these kids, because the kids do not have urban hukou, and then so they cannot really go to the school in the urban area. So I don't really have time to talk about hukou, because we can spend whole 2 days here instead of a 20-minute talk. So maybe next time. And so these are the difficulty for the government to deal with. And then the government do realize that there are issues that I have talked about before. So the rural land contracting law that was introduced in 2003, that was trying to deal with the issue of the small farm plot as well as the tenancy issue. So in my own research, we estimated how this reform actually had the impact on productivity. So this particular reform was formalizing the legal protection for contract. So prior to the reform, you can lease out to people, but then you can lease out to your friends or family. That's usually in the black market. If something goes wrong, you cannot really sue them. Okay. However, once they introduce this law, that means you can lease it even to the stranger as long as you have the contract. If something goes wrong, you can actually go to court about it. So with this introduction of this law, we actually find that the overall productivity increased by 7%. And then most of this productivity increase are actually coming from the fact that people who are not too productive are now leasing out their land to people who are really productive. So if you're not a good farmer, maybe you shouldn't do farming, and you can just lease out your land and then move to the urban area. And then another issue was the migration that we were talking about before. So the government actually tried to encourage people now to migrate to smaller cities, rather than moving hundreds of miles away to the big city like Shanghai or Beijing, where it's impossible to get a hukou. If you move to the closer city, now you have a better chance of getting an urban hukou. And then there is also issue with the urbanization. So why don't we just introduce more jobs to the rural area, or urbanize the whole rural area? That's not an easy task. So the government tried to set up some of these mid-rises, right? Why don't we move the farmers into the mid-rises, and then we can set up shops or factories, and then taking back their land instead of letting them do farming. We'll introduce new type of jobs. But you have to think about who are these people that were left behind in the rural area. Most of them are old, and then their only skills have been farming. So how can they survive in this new transitional economy? So maybe for the young, they can. So I don't want to end this talk in such a pessimistic note. I just want to remind you that China has gone through this amazing changes where a lot of people were alleviated out of poverty, and then the future is quite bright. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Liu. And so our final presentation will be by Professor Liu. Let me get you up.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I want first to thank the Baker Institute for Public Policy and Child Center, as well as for Asian Study, for making this talk possible. Because this year, 2018, is really a significant year, because 40 years ago, not because I was born, but because something fundamentally have happened in China. So to put things in perspective, I like to first look into the past before we look into the future. So let me show you some pictures about China then. So what was China like before the reform era? So this is China like in the urban setting, where this political campaign struggle happened all the time with a big character poster hanging on the wall. And in the rural area, there's people's commune. You can see they trying to make steel in the back of the picture, which is not a quite efficient way to make steel. And political struggles is constant theme in both rural and urban area. And if you become a political struggle target, not only your fate is doomed, but as well as your family's members and relatives. And children, say for example during the Great Famines, have to find things on the field to get something on the table, if possible. If you dare to challenge, or not challenge, criticize Chairman Mao for its policy, so Peng Dehuai at the time was a general, is very well respected, was, after the Lausanne meeting, got put into as labeled as anti-revolutionary, and just political career is over. No one's in middle, including the father of the current President Xi Jinping. So this person in the middle of the figure is the father of President Xi Jinping at the time, was also unfortunately labeled as anti-revolutionary. But what's China now? So this is Guangzhou from, I think, in the last few years. You can see the Guangzhou Tower in the back. It's a really vibrant city. And this is a really common urban city across China. And this a picture taken, I think, from the Huaxi village is one of the, I think, pretty advanced village. You can see all their condos and then for the villagers. And this is a picture in one of the mall in Guangdong. It's pretty much like the mall here in the United States. And I'm still trying to figure out what's something in the middle, because I hope it's not someone when they finish the shopping in the 5th floor and can have the fast track onto the ground floor. And China developed so fast that even there's some technology actually has made United States look like a third world country. For example, mobile payment is very popular in China in the last few years, to the extent that even for the mom and pop shop, not only as well as the street vendor, have this kind of a QR code you can see on the front of the screen that people can pay using their cell phone. And even to the extent, I found this picture online that for the beggar, they also have a QR code that you can donate for their money. So that tells you how much is the Chinese transformation. And then just show you the last picture, this is Pudong, Shanghai in 1990. This is Pudong, Shanghai in 2010. Okay? So you see the background in the Pudong area is fully developed. So I would say that, of course, just like my panelists, we can talk about the reform over and over, and I just want to focus on 2 points, well, maybe 1 point, but I want to clear some, I would say, commonly held belief that may not be as correct. First, there's some common held belief is that Chinese economic prosperity is driven by its economic reform. Well, not so much, because yes, well, I guess it's yes and no. Yes, there's some fundamental change in the market institution that really make people to devote their effort to more productive activity, like innovation, like improving the efficiency. But there's something on the background that there's something have fundamental change in the political system that leads to the change in the economic system. There's another common held belief saying that while China have embraced this great economic transformation without any political reform, not so much. If you're a close observer about Chinese politics, and as well as to look at the picture you just saw, something have fundamental change in the Chinese politics that otherwise we not see those great cultural revolution, great famines happen for the 30 years, and then another great change in the last 30 years. So there are many aspects of Chinese reforms in the last 4 decades, but I'm going to only talk about one, and one thing I think is the most essential one that can probably summarize all the political reform in China to date, which is the institutionalization of Chinese politics. So what do I mean by institutionalization? That means there are a set of rules of the game that for the political elite to interact with each other. So as Professor Fang have mentioned that there's international arena, there's international organization set up the rule of the game for country to interact. In the case of China, that since the reform era, there was a set of institutionalization that allowed political elite to interact. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the limits of those institutionalizations. And finally, I'm going to touch briefly on the institutional equilibrium that maybe has been disrupted in the last few years. But you probably heard a lot from David earlier. So what I would consider the most important political reform since 1978 is there's institutionalization of elite management. Meaning that when there's a power change hands, you don't have to kill each other. So politics is about who get what, when, and how. So this is really critical for any country to manage manage the political elites. I mean, you might be laughing here that, oh, tomorrow's we're going to have elections here in these countries. I don't think any candidates was expecting to get killed if they lose elections. But you look around the world, many political candidates really worry about if they lose the election tomorrow, there will be life-threatening, not only to them, but to their party, to their own livelihood. And that's quite important for the Chinese politics, that people don't have to kill each other at the top. And the second important part of institutionalization is about cadre management. So if you only have a strong elite at the top, that's not enough for a country to develop. You need to also have a large body of bureaucrats, rank and file, politicians, and party members help you implement those policies. And Chinese governments and the party has been institutionalized cadre management about to provide the right incentive. Just take about some example of our institutionalization of elite management. Tournament. You might be laughing. You're like, this is very trivial things, right? Tournament. But for many non-democratic regimes, there is a reason that there is no tournaments, or the tournament is only on paper. But the Chinese Communist Party managed to have these tournaments since 1978, while starting more formally implemented in the 1990s. When you reach at a certain age, for example, if you want to be at the PSC, Politburo Standing Committee, if you reach beyond 67, I'm sorry, you cannot serve there. I mean, you might say, okay, this is a discrimination against the elderly. But there's a reason they set up this rule, because they don't want those people have already political power to hang on to the power forever. The second thing is related to the tournaments is not only you only can serve 2 terms at most for many positions, there is strict retirement and promotion age requirements. Again, I'm sorry. So I say this is not a discrimination against the elderly. Well, again, it's for the same logic that they do not want people hold political power to stay forever from top to bottom. And the third, that as we have observed since the 1990s, there is a very deliberate and prepared succession process. And think about Hu Jintao came to power in 2002, and he was somewhat like prepared as the successors around the early 90s. Now, give me another country where a leader was prepared for succession over the course of 10 years, that nothing happens, that he assumed power 10 years later. So, as evidence of this elite management of institutionalization, you see that there's more regular meeting at the party level. There is a multiple veto point in the political system, that no one can make decisions on their own. And there's a lot of negotiation, bargaining behind the scene. Maybe you see some radical policy changes. Next day there's some policy change reform in the media, but that has gone through multiple negotiation, bargaining within the system. It's not like one day that things change, a leader change his mind, and the elite policy change. And that's important. The second, for the cadre management, that the so-called cadre responsibility system, in a sense, is that to help local politicians accountable for what? Well, maybe before the reform era is about showing your loyalty, showing that you're loyal to the party, you're willing to engage in those ideological campaign. But after reform era, it's about performance. The party have fundamentally changed its agenda from an ideological struggle to economic development. So in a sense that they developed a system to allow higher level government to have a better monitoring and compliance of local officials. And then they also help them accountable that if you cannot deliver, you are out. Of course, political connection matters. But think about Xi Jinping. Yes, he's princeling, but there's many other princelings out there. He spent, I would think, 30 years working from the very bottom to become started with the Hebei province, spent 3 years there, and then another 22 years in Fujian province, started with the prefectures, mayor, party secretary, and then the vice governor, and to the party secretary, and then to Zhejiang and Shanghai, before finally assuming the party secretary. So there's a multiple system in there to evaluate the cadres. And then there's also a 1995 reform. I don't think many of you heard about this, but it's really fundamentally trying to put better candidates for the party. It used to be for many government and local people's Congress, the only candidates up for election are only can be sponsored by the party. But the 1990 reform allowed delegates to put their own candidate for elections. Yes, most of the CCP sponsored candidates still wins, but this reform really changed the way they manage local cadres to put more competent people in the office, because if a local organizational department failed to put someone into the office that get defeated by the delegates sponsored candidates, that means they have not put the right person in the right place. That's just really fundamental, because that helped them to keep a large group of competent, actually local politicians, to help them accomplish their tasks. Now, what's the impact of the institutionalizations? Well, in the language of a political scientist, it's all about creating stability for political and policy making. And that also lead to a subnational competition for economic development that actually give politicians incentive to promote economic development instead of trying to strike down each other, meaning to divert their energy to more productive sources. And also give them some idea about local policy experimentations, because you want to be creative. If you think that only way to promote economic growth is through FDI, but you're in the inland, you may not be so good for FDI, you might be creative to find other ways to attract FDI or to adopt some other policies that promote economic growth. Now, so I've been saying a lot of good things about institutionalization, but that's not a silver bullet. There actually are quite some limitations. So in terms of elite managements, there's always challenge in power sharing among elites. Why? Because you want a strong leader can hold the group together, but you don't want someone too strong that refuses to share power. I mean, during the 90s, in the 80s and 90s, so Deng Xiaoping is always on the back, even though he's not like a party secretary, but he's really holding the thing together. Even when the China reform was going backwards, he was the person to step up to really move China to the more greater economic liberalization. And then also think about, there's a lot of discussion about China really have this kind of political meritocracy where they select the most competent person to put in office. But as any time you think about political selection, well, you have a problem of you trying to decide between loyalty and competence. The best case scenario is you find someone is really loyal and extremely competent. Well, it's really hard, right? From the top leader, and then the next step is, okay, if I choose someone really competent but not loyal, then at some point down to the future, he could challenge you, right? And then the third strategy, maybe choosing someone is loyal but not so competent. Of course, someone is not loyal nor competent is out of the picture, okay? But they can do this, they can rely more on competence at the lower level of political selection, because those people rarely can challenge people at the top. But at the people at the very top, that's where the political meritocracy breaks down. Because the number one will never try to choose a more competent number two. Every time that you try to select a successor, you want to make sure that person is too competent and to challenge you. And because in this kind of situation, someone will ask, why not me? Why do I have to wait? And also that because this kind of a slight preferences to loyalty, you start to see that each leader is slightly weaker than the previous leader, because no one wants to choose a more competent leader. Then when you see a more balanced, more equal balance of power among political elites, again, some other elites will start to ask, why not me, right? So start before the 18th Party Congress, before Xi Jinping assumed power, between 2003 and 2008, when Bo Xilai was, I don't know how many of you heard of him, he was once a very famous politician in Chongqing. He was actually, making a lot of noises that no other politician have made so much, try to promote himself through anti-corruption campaign and somewhat nationalism towards the left, so the so-called movement New Left, in China at the time. But, I mean, unfortunately, his wife engaged in some crime that the whole thing's go bust. And then what about the cadre management? I mean, China facing constant challenge in improving local governance. Because on the one hand, you provide this kind of a cadre responsibility system that meaning you want to make sure local politicians delivers and be competent. But competent on what, right? And competence mostly measured by the tasks assigned by the high-level governments. And if you're a smart local politicians, you will focus on things are observable, can be delivered in a very short time, and then you will focus things that matter the most for the person that you think that has most instrumental in your promotion. And that really distorts some of the incentive structure of local politicians trying to develop the economy at all costs. That's why we see the environmental problems. That's why we see some human rights abuse. That's why we see some brute force investment of some unpopular policies, because they want to achieve those observables, outcomes in the eyes of their politicians, high level. And then another, I would say, potential problem, I would say, to this so-called political meritocracy system, meaning that local politicians have to perform, is the tasks are designed by the higher level officials. So for this system to function well, the underlying assumption is you have a good emperor out there giving good tasks. Well, maybe there's sometimes that you have a good emperor really give out some good tasks that can promote the society, but can you guarantee that you have a good emperor for the next 20 years, 30 years, next centuries? Well, look at GE, right? It just got kicked out from the Dow Index. And think about GE's success was because, well, partly because the CEO, Jack, I forgot his last name, Welch, right? And look how Welch left. They have changed the CEO, I think, at least 3 or 4 times. They struggled. So that tells you that when you have a good leader, you're great, but sometimes you're bound to have one that's just for pure luck. I mean, this is just a company, but think about China is of 1.4 billion people. That have significant consequences. So I'm not going to spend so much time on this because I think that David have spoke a lot about the recent developments, but I would say the recent development is concerning with this institutionalized process. We already see some indicator about the institutionalization, about breaking the rules, about elite managements. So last year, actually, before the 19th Party Congress, was quite significant in the sense that they're supposed to do 2 things, most significant for Chinese politics. One, they need to replace, I think, 5 out of 7 Politburo Standing Committee members, because the 5 members are beyond retirement age, that beyond the promotion age can stay there. And then not to mention there are many other members in the Central Military Commissions as well as the Politburo itself. Number 2, if it went by the previous norms, successors for the General Party Secretary and the Premier should be named for 2022. And no one knows for sure any one of those going to happen, because there's argument about they might break some rules, and there's some channels say that age requirement is only a recommendation. Well, yes, there's no written in the rule book, but that's an unspoken norm been governing this institutionalization of Chinese politics in the last 40 years. So if you follow the end result is actually one rule was followed, one rule is broken. The rule as follows is for the people that are not eligible for the promotion age, they're out. The new people come in, they all actually fit the promotion age. So that norm was followed. But if you look carefully of those members who just entered the Politburo Standing Committee, you can tell there's no successors. Because why? By 2022, none of those members will be young enough to stay on. So that's concerning because it creates a lot of uncertainty. And second, as we see in the last 5 years, there's a lack of back and forth in central government policies. And to us, political scientists, that means nothing is probably a little bit broken, is the consensus building in policymaking. So that was the impact. What was the impact of the Chinese government's behavior as well as the economy? Well, local politicians become risk averse. In the current anti-corruption climates, that doing less is better than doing more. So they try to stay low. Just if you ask me to do 10 things, I will do those 10 things. I'm not going to do extra. I'm not going to try to promote economic growth as wholehearted as before, because who knows next time that I'm going to be charged with something. No one's safe. And then there's regression about policy coordinations. And that actually, as David mentioned, that sent some mixed signal to the other countries what's going on, right? And most fundamentally for the economic environment, it creates this kind of uncertain political environments. So uncertainty is bad for business. For example, if you want to develop R&D, you want to make sure that when the policy 10 years after you develop the products will actually allow your product to be sold on the market. So I actually was talking to a pharmaceutical company CEO. He was telling me it's a really hard time to put in money for the drug development in his company because they don't know how the government policy is going to change, whether or not that drug is going to be part of the state insurance. If it is not, that means the market is much, much smaller. And that means a different thing for the R&D development. So where are we now? We're here. We're waiting for the other shoes to drop in 2022. So one shoe has already dropped in 2017. And if someone tells you they know what's going to happen in 2022, they're either a liar or they have no idea what they're talking about. Because currently, everybody is trying to figure out what the other person is trying to do inside China. No one knows what exactly is going to happen, including Xi Jinping, honestly. Well, I don't have his phone number, so I didn't talk to him about it. But if he knows exactly what he's doing, he does not have to change the term limits for the presidency. I mean, some people, outside observers, would say, oh, this is a really power concentration. I'm a contrarian. I would say, well, that means he hasn't consolidated his power, so he has to change the rule. Because otherwise, he would just be like Deng Xiaoping, sitting on the back, but still have the full control of the political system. So hopefully in 2022, we are on to a better path for Chinese people and Chinese society, and more important for the entire world. But again, we are waiting for the other shoes to drop in 2022. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could ask our panelists to join us up here, we'll field some questions from the audience. Sure. Who would like to start us off? In the back there?
Of the population are members of the Communist Party, because I thought it was a small percentage of the population. So the comments related to the strengthening of the Communist Party and the laws, etc. What are they ripe for an overthrow because they're a small part of the population?
Xiaobo, maybe you should start with it.
Well, in terms of the numbers, right now it's 80 million, about around that, give and take, 80 million party members.
1.5 billion.
It's about 6%.
Yeah. But I don't think if Chinese Communist Party collapsed tomorrow, there's no other organization in China right now is capable for cross-China mobilization.
By the way, the same number in Russia is 5%.
Did anybody else want to comment?
So maybe not directly related to your question, but I think it's still relevant, which is there are a lot of ordinary people who are communist members, and they don't necessarily draw direct benefit from party. The regular folks as a worker or someone who work in the state bureaucrat. I think there is a misunderstanding. Somehow, party members are a very special thing, and somehow they're seen as deriving a lot of private benefits from being in the Communist Party. Today, the party membership is much more of a sort of a thing you have to acquire if you want to advance in your career. So it's something you want to get over with so that you can advance, rather than some indication about commitment to ideology. I would say so. It's much more of a sort of career advancement a phase that you have to go through.
I think also I can just chime in here too that, and I'm sure our other scholars can talk more about this too, but if you talk to Chinese Communist Party members and they talk about advancing up within the party, they'll talk about how they have like mentors, in different divisions, and they also have all kinds of tests and evaluations, and so it's an extremely sophisticated process. It kind of sounds like McKinsey, actually, if you talk to people who work for McKinsey, and they talk about how you have multiple different partners advising you and all kinds of evaluations. It's fairly sophisticated, and that might explain some of its durability, but also why people might still want to join.
And this thing also has changed over decades. When I was young, it's much more of a ideological commitment if you want to get into party. I would say in the 80s. Now it's much more of a individuals will have to pursue the party membership so that they have a bigger, brighter future. But today, I think the government or the organization actually actively go after people who are good, because they want to recruit more talented people, and sort of that's another way to legitimize the party, right? So the party actually actively go after talented individual, which is totally different from 20 years ago. Individuals will have to try to get in the party. Now they are being sought in, and even if they don't want to get in, they are under pressure to get in. So it's a very different mentality, the dynamic between individuals and party today.
Maybe another question?
What is the effect of the political reform on higher level education in China, in particular in natural sciences and engineering?
So,
anyone want to take that?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part. What was the
Is the political reform affecting in any way high-level education in China in natural sciences and engineering?
In some way, yes. For example, their reform in 1997 to expand the quota that who can go to college across China. To fund this effort, at the time, also trying to stimulate the economy, they say that we should think about higher education as an industry. So that really changed the mission of many universities, trying to greatly expand its campus, trying to engage in some economic activities, transfer R&D into firms. And the political reform, also I think after 1989, Tiananmen Square, so pretty much the university today is under highly control by the party to make sure it will never happen again where the student go on the street, challenge the party. But I would have to say, by and large, the politics affecting higher education is not as significant because the parties still view the higher education as the reservoir for the expertise they need to develop the economy.
And Related to that, it's very important to think about how the government legitimizes power. So in democracy, we think about electoral process. That's the process. So whichever individual ended up winning the presidency, he or she will be respected because the process is seen as legitimate. So if you think about Chinese one-party system, and if it wants to continue and survive this competition really around China, a lot of democracies that are more developed and very attractive political model, you have to find grounds to legitimize the power. So very important criteria or the thinking process behind Chinese government is that it has to perform, bring results. So in academics, we call it performance legitimacy. So rather than electoral legitimacy, you want performance legitimacy. So that means you have to attract talented people into this enterprise and also produce talented people to have the economy grow, especially economy to grow.
Just one more note on that. Maybe you're also thinking that in the past you had this technocracy being a word used to describe Chinese leaders, because the previous generation of leaders, you had a lot who were engineers, and Tsinghua University in Beijing had a strategy of trying to place its students at higher levels, and so. But the very current leaders and the rise in the next generation of leaders, you're having more lawyers, economists from a broader background. But at the same time, you do have this enormous investment in research. And so the top 11 universities in China, I think they're getting an extra $100 million a year, each from the central government. And then the largest cities like Shanghai and Beijing are matching that. So can you imagine that there's an enormous investment? China really wants to play a very large role in that in the future.
That's the real threat to the United States, the growth of economic in China because of their investment in education compared to the limited investment in education in the United States in natural sciences and engineering. So instead of investing in education in these areas, we find other reasons why we have to fight them back.
Yeah.
Bravo, I totally agree.
Another question? Yeah, there.
You know, it appears that China is doing a very thorough job of controlling the entire population through the society points and everything, and forcing the people to do exactly what they're supposed to be doing. How do you reconcile, or how do you see the intersection of I'll use your words, the good emperor deciding what the right thing to do, if you're taking away a lot of the freedom for people to do things out of the box or do kind of crazy things to really innovate. I know they're doing a lot of education, a lot of very talented and outstanding engineering and science works there, but it seems like the development has to do a lot with the creativity and unleashing them. But if you're trying to control the people, how do you foster the creativity?
Well, just a word on that. It's a great question, and I think it gets at one of the central tensions and kind of conundrums in China, which is a desire on the part of the leadership for a pretty substantial level of political control in the country, coupled with another desire on the part of the same leadership to become an innovation leader and pioneer in the world. And I think, as the premise of your question suggests, there is an inherent structural tension between those two desires. Just a word on the social credit score that's been reported about here, and it's been talked about in China and publicized openly there. It's sort of Fair Isaac plus. It's like your credit score in the United States plus quite a bit more. It basically is designed to encourage good behavior and discourage bad behavior. I recently learned that things like how many video games you've purchased with a credit card recently can affect your social credit score, because if you're using that time to play video games, you're not using that time for other productive things. And there's a whole host of things in there. It's the marriage of big data, artificial intelligence, and a leadership that rightly or wrongly seeks to try to use the tools of policy to generate what it judges to be more productive and healthy behavior on the part of its citizenry. From an American vantage point, it doesn't sound like an idea that can work very well. I think from many countries' perspectives, it would be a very difficult thing to do to try to engineer that type of outcome, probably impossible, in fact. But that said, if you look at the details of the plan, while it goes much, much further than the credit score in the United States does, for example, it has elements of that in it as well that are designed to sort of say who this person is and what level of trust, et cetera. But it goes beyond the mere financial trustworthiness, i.e. eligibility for a credit card, and goes into a whole sphere that would be very uncomfortable for most in America and other parts of the world. But I personally think, and I've said this here and I've said it in China, I've said it in English and I've said it in Chinese, I try to be very consistent in my messaging. I don't think that level of effort to endeavor to generate that much social control in China is in China's best interests over the long term. And I've said that there publicly. It's not my decision to make, but I very much embrace the premise of your question, which is for a country that is seeking to become the innovation superpower of the world, engineering that through a social credit program doesn't make a lot of sense. And I actually think that, in my judgment, the Chinese leadership would be well served to think about what really gets them to innovation superpowerdom and to ask some probing and critical questions about whether some of the policies that are in place today actually take China where China wants to go. So I think there's some concerns around that, and I think over a period of time, the proof will be in the pudding, and China will ultimately, I think, as was noted by Song Ying earlier, make decisions that it judges to be in its best interest.
Can I just very quickly to your questions? So China today's Chinese society is not 1984, where the government exerts great control to every aspect of people's lives. And so you're asking how this control can coexist with the innovations. So I think the two things. First, for all the innovations, government has actually given a lot of freedom to science engineering in developing those products. It's in the social science, unfortunately for political science, where we don't get much in the university, that people complain they don't get much of those funding unless you study something that is big data, help the social credit system, right? To some extent, the Chinese society is very, I would say, complex in the sense that you have a lot of freedom, actually more free than America. I have several American students that went to China and they came back, told me that sorry, I don't want to use their language, but they basically, no one give something that what you're doing over there. And they should just China's much freer. So the Chinese government do understand there's a social contract. You cannot control every aspect of people's life. They gave a lot of freedom on certain aspects. And I will add to the social contract that David mentioned earlier. So not only the government pledged themselves they're going to make you rich, but it's under the conditions that you're not going to challenge them politically. So that's the condition that I will make you rich. So in terms of the money-making sphere, the people have a lot of freedom to engage in a lot of activities, but not in the political sphere.
Yep. What are the alternatives? What are the characteristics of an alternative to fight fire, other than wait for them to collapse?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and I think. Sorry, the question is, what are the alternatives from a U.S. policy perspective to fighting fire with fire and adopting the worst practices of China as best practices, essentially? The alternative is to do what we've always done: innovate, compete, and win. That's what we've always done. That's how we became the world's economic superpower. It's how we became the superpower of the world, period. And my concern, which I've laid out publicly in a number of talks this year, is that the things that the Trump administration is advocating are things that take us away from the very principles that have made America the most economically successful nation in the world and the largest economy. We have always welcomed investment. We should continue to welcome it as long as it's lawful and all the better if it's job creating. We've always welcomed the exchange of people. We've benefited from that. The notion that somehow the United States and only native-born Americans that came, whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower are the sole sources of innovation in the United States of America is just plain wrong. It's a failure to understand the concept of innovation at a very fundamental level. When we start shutting doors, we start closing down the things in our economy that have made us the shining city on the hill, certainly economically speaking. So the alternative to doing what we're doing now, as the business community has noted, and as I certainly agree, is to actually do the things that we did for the last couple of hundred years that made us the most successful economy in the history of the world. Be open. Be open to investment. Be open to ideas. Be open to students. Be open to the exchanges of people back and forth. Yes, protect your intellectual property. Yes, protect your lawful interests. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'll give you one example that really struck me, if I may. This was something reported in a major media publication that apparently President Trump quipped to one of his senior aides, "You see, I put the tariffs on, and now all this Chinese money is rolling into our coffers." And the aide said to the president, "Well, Mr. President, we're the ones paying for the tariffs. It's not the Chinese, it's the American companies." And the conversation sort of ended there. I don't think taxing the American people and taxing businesses and ultimately the American people 10%, 25% is a very smart way to keep the historic levels of GDP growth and income growth that we now have going. As a political matter, I might say I've also never seen an incumbent president run against the economy, as the healthy economy, as aggressively as this president is doing. But again, he goes by a very different set of rules, and I understand that. But I think staying true to our values, staying true to who we are as a country, staying true to the principles that made this country the most robust economy ever known in the world. That's how we go forward. There are things that can be done and should be done to deal with some of the inequities in the trade relationship with China. There are massive asymmetries. Our markets are much more open than theirs are. You can use Baidu, the search engine here. You cannot use Google there. And we could go down the long list of asymmetries that exist. But in the end, I think that what concerns me most about the policy response of this administration is that we're retreating from the things that have made us strong. And I don't think that's who we are as a country. I know it's not what brought us to where we are as a country, and I think it's a course that we need to think very carefully about before we pursue any further.
So can I?
Did you want to add?
Can I
Sure.
Right, so I want to.
I agree with all that. But if I were president, I'd still be thinking about what the hell do I do in the regime.
So I would say, so I want to add to that. One is more of a specific solution to the trade war, for example, that the president is thinking about. It seems that also taking the rational choice perspective that I was talking about, from the U.S. perspective, the best strategy is really working with the allies and utilize the existing multilateral organizations, negotiate with China, whether it's within the WTO or within other multilateral institutions. The existing institutions institutions are set up in such a way that it has served U.S. interest. And then there's allies. Those military alliances are not just for military purposes. They also speak to economic relations between the Europeans and Americans. Really, the right strategy, it seems to me, is working with the allies and utilizing the existing institutional arrangement and negotiate from the position of strength with China. So that's for the specific trade problems. In the long run, I very much agree with what David is saying, that there's a country's influence in the world, it's not just based on hard power, whether it's economic power or military power. A huge part of U.S. influence is soft power. And that is being, I would say, wasted or being decreased very rapidly now because of what's happening domestically. So that reduces the appeal of U.S. model. I think when you think about Chinese people who have access to international travel and who have lots of Chinese students coming over here, they do get to see alternative models. So when the U.S. would pick up pieces and continue to become more attractive as a political model, then they get to see the comparison, and they will have more thinking about what the domestic politics should be like. But when you don't have a competitive alternative model, then people have less leverage, I would say, in other systems. So at the end of the day, I think the short-term wise, going by the existing norm and rules to deal with the trade problem, in the long run, building up a shiny example or continue to increase that appeal, which then provide competition between states.
Let me just say one more sentence, just to sum up the one point. We need to treat China as the formidable competitor that it is, not as the enemy that it is not. That's my view.
So I think we have time for one last question. I think
Ronald Reagan was rather direct with Russia, to some good effect, I think. And I think the world's safer personally when China puts the exclamation mark, as you said, in their speech about basically, you mess with Taiwan, I'll do this in my own good time. By the way, it's very smart of them to take a long time, and they're very patient. But if you mess with me, the world ain't going to end as you know it. And they're very direct about it. And the world's probably safer because they said that. And I don't think that it's an equal and opposite unreasonable thing to say back. Stop stealing our IP. And they do. This is one way they solve the problem that was being discussed earlier about education, is if you can steal it, why make it, okay? And it is a very serious thing. I'm involved in some medical stuff, and you can't file the patent. It's absolutely impossible to control it. That is a real thing. Absolutely. And I don't think it's unfair to tell the Chinese, you pick the tariff and we'll both use it. That is as egalitarian as it gets. That's not the same as you change your tariff and we're going to nuke you. And you shouldn't confuse the two. I think Chinese, and I used to live over there too, so I know a little bit about it, do care about, the face goes both ways. If you just shrinking violet and go away, wring your hands, you're going to end up encouraging what you least find attractive. I don't think it's reasonable to stand there and watch this happen.
No, and I agree, but let me say this. You know what I think the reason is that Reagan and other Republican presidents and other Democratic presidents never managed to solve the intellectual property rights theft problem? Was because no president from Nixon through President Obama was able to judge, nor was the private sector, that there was a solution to that problem that was better than the problem. That's why it never got solved. Because there was a sense that over time, under those assumptions, things were going to get better. There was a long-term play. Let companies make decisions for themselves and judge based on their shareholder interests and on their leadership judgments and assessments what is in the best interest of those companies. It's not for federal governments. Reagan would turn over in his grave at the idea that the federal government would tell companies what's in their best interests. But we're starting to do that now. The IPR problem is real. It's big. Steve Ballmer recently just said that it probably costs Microsoft alone $10 billion in profits per year. He said that 1 or 2 days ago, and it's multiply that times every big company in this country. It is a real question. It's a real problem. It's a major problem. It's been a problem for 20 or 30 years, and the size of the problem has gotten bigger because the nature of our engagement with China has gotten bigger. But the question is, how do you actually solve the problem in a surgical way that protects the legitimate lawful interests of the United States without throwing the baby out with the bathwater and depressing economic activity, hurting the interests of shareholders and companies, and so forth? That, I think we're seeing an axe applied to a problem that needs a scalpel. But let me also say this. President Trump has stated very clearly that these are his words, and we've all heard them many, many times. His number one priority with respect to the trade relationship with China is to bring down the deficit. Has anybody heard him say that over the last 3 years? Right, to bring down, right, the U.S. trade deficit with China, he wants to reduce it. Here's an interesting data point, and this goes to my point. January 1st to September 30th of last year, the deficit was X. January 1st to September 31st of this year, it was X plus 15%. Our deficit with China has gone up this year. In fact, in September of this year, the single month deficit broke the all-time record in the history of the United States for trade with any country. My point is not that Trump's wrong because his policies aren't achieving my objectives. My point is that he's wrong because his policies aren't achieving his objectives. That's the problem with it. The deficit's going up. The overall trade level and volume is going down, but guess what? Newsflash, the deficit is not only staying the same, it's actually increasing. We need to actually think through these things before we say that, what sounds like a tough course is really the best course for our country. Do we need to fix IPR? Absolutely. Have we fixed it yet? No. Do we need to fix the deficit? Arguably, we need to make it look a little more like what it should look like if there were free trade between the countries. Have we done that? No, we've gone in the opposite direction. Let's actually solve the problems rather than issuing recriminations and demonizations. And that's what we're trying to help do.
Yeah, Elaine?
Yeah, can I add a little bit about the trade deficit? Actually, it's not quite clear whether the Trump policy has been effective or not, because part of the reason why the trade deficit increased from last year to this year was because companies, in anticipation of the tariff going up, are stocking up in terms of their inputs. So that's why the trade deficit has actually increased. So it's actually, from the economist's point of view, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen because it was quite unprecedented. The last time we have the tariff hike like this was back in Great Depression. And there are many, many studies trying to look at how would the tariff increase affect the economy. And most studies conclude that actually it's going to negatively impact both sides. So it's hard to say in the long run how that's going to affect the American company because this one term, it could be just the stocking up effect.
All right, well, clearly we could talk all night. So first of all, thank you all for coming. And please also help me thank our guests.